So there we have it. So that's what we're all rich in. Now, let's pick up where we had left off. Here we go. So, where are we in the church age? So let me show you something. Before we get into that, I want to show you something to set the stage. Let me find it. Because we had already wrote it once, and I want to show this to you. Right here. All right. So here is the church. Here's the church. From AD 30 all the way to today and the future with the rapture, right? And look at Smyrna. So we say that Smyrna was just past the first century. They were your second century church. But keep in mind that there was a type of believer in each one of these different church ages. Meaning, there were people who were being persecuted and put to death right after Stephen is one of them. And then there's others who would kill all the apostles. So there were people dying back in this day. It was more prevalent in this day because God told them that they were going to face the 10 persecutions. And then there was still people dying for the cause of Christ all throughout each one of these churches. So that was a type of Smyrna church throughout all the churches. Even today, friend, there are people being put to death for the cause of Christ. So the church of Smyrna is still going on. All right, or the type of Smyrna. That's what I want to say. All right, but notice, right? So remember, back in these days, in the early church were all Jews. Every single member of the early church went when the day of Pentecost came and the Spirit of God fell upon the 120 that was in the upper room? Yeah, wherever they were, right? So that 120, all those people were Jews. That was in a single Gentile. Why? They were celebrating Pentecost. They were celebrating the Jewish feast. So what happened? They went out, spoke in tongues, and all the Jews who had came from around the world, because you got to remember, there was 3 main feasts that every Jewish male had to go back to Jerusalem to celebrate. They had no choice, okay? They had to go there. Day of Atonement, Pentecost, they had to be there. And that's why they were over in Jerusalem during that time. So all these people came from all the nations all around. And some of these people were born in those other nations. So did they understand the native Hebrew language that was spoken in Israel during that day? Most of them no. They either spoke Italian, they spoke Cretan, they spoke Greek, wherever they came from, right? Syrian, whatever language. They came from all these different nations and they came back to Jerusalem. So when the apostles and the disciples spoke in tongues, what happened? Those people heard the Jews who didn't speak those languages speak and praise God and preach the gospel in their native tongue. They spoke French, they spoke German, they spoke Russian, they spoke Chinese, they spoke all those different types of languages. Wherever these Jews came from, when the disciples spoke in tongues, they spoke a known language where the person who was from those countries heard it and understood it clearly. And that's what made them marvel behind it. Now, why do I say that? Because the first persecutions that came from the church didn't necessarily come from Rome. I'm going to explain that in more detail. But this is why Jesus addressed the Jews first. He says, hey, I know the blasphemy of the Jews. So let's talk about this, friends. How did the Jews blaspheme God's name? And that's the question you got to be asked. He knew there were Jews, but there were Jews who were doing a certain act. They were doing something. Bible calls it blasphemy. What did they do? Well, we got a good idea of what they were doing. Paul told us some things in Romans chapter 11. So let's go look over at Romans chapter 11. Now, this isn't the only place, but it's a very, very good, give you a very, very good understanding of what the Jews were actually doing when God said, this is Jesus talking, friends. This is Jesus saying there were blasphemy of the Jews. So this is God saying the Jews were doing this. Was it Paul? Was it John? Was it some apostle? Jesus Christ himself was saying that these Jews was blaspheming. So I'm going to read a good portion of this, and I'm not going to explain it all, but I'm going to get to certain things and I'll stop, make some comments and move on, because I don't want to get stuck trying to explain the whole book, whole chapter of Romans 11, because it'll take us weeks to get through this. I'm talking about the daily stuff. Anyhow, I say then, Romans 11, starting at verse 1, has God cast away his people? Who is Paul talking about? He's talking about Israel. Now, listen. Is all the Jews or Israelites in Israel God's people? No, of course not, friends. The nation is God's people. The nation is made up of believing Jews and unbelieving Jews. So Kevin, you speaking against the Jews? Man, I ain't speaking against no Jews. I'm quoting you what the words say. This is why you got to be very careful. And I don't